Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Brad Glosserman. Brad is a visiting professor at Tama University, as well as a deputy director of the Center for Rulemaking Strategies at Tama University. He is also a senior advisor for the Pacific Forum, and a returning guest on this podcast. In our previous discussion, we spoke about Brad's first book, The Japan-Korea Identity Clash, and we focused that discussion around the relationship between those two countries and how they fit in with American interests in the region. And at the very tail end of that podcast, we mentioned Brad's latest book, which is Peak Japan, The End of Great Ambitions. And it's that we're going to speak about today. We're going to focus entirely on this book and its ramifications for other countries who are or who will be soon going through exactly what Japan are going through. And of course, the parallels to South Korea are there for anyone to see. We're going to walk through the history of Japan, its cyclical rises and falls, its expectations, and then the decline and the collapse of those expectations across the years and across different eras. But this book, and of course this podcast, will focus much more on the present moment and on recent history. So the story really begins to wind up around the tail end of the Cold War, up to the turn of the century and the Asian financial crisis, then onwards to the Lehman shocks and the global financial crisis of 2008, and just how this economic downturn has affected Japan, and why Japan has failed to grow, why it has stagnated across these decades, and why it has failed to pull itself out of this slump. A hugely important aspect in this, of course, is the political environment inside Japan, the structures, the institutions, the culture, the leadership dynamics, and all the things that compound together to begin to explain why Japan has failed to pull itself out of the slump. From here, we're going to talk about international diplomacy and the challenging issue of the Senkaku Islands, or even Dokdo of the coast of Korea, and just how these international disputes, primarily with China, has forced Japan to ask fundamental questions about its place in the world, its external identity, and just what kind of foreign policy it wants to continue into the future. We're going to step forward then into 2011 with the twin crises of the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear catastrophe. And moments like this give us a real keen insight into just where Japan sees itself, and just where the deep challenges inside the society really lay. And from this we will build up to the present moment, and the return of Shinzo Abe to the political scene, and the highest office in the country. But the real fundamental grounding in this book, the real reason why it is so important, is the deep psychological questions it asks about societies like Japan and so many others around the world, and the cycles of growth that so many people had attached their identities to for so long, and of great power ambitions, which at a certain point in economic, political and cultural development might just be something that societies turn away from. It might just be the case that Japan is not in a moment of crisis. It's just in a moment of conscious downsizing, of deliberate stasis, of a comfortable retraction back into itself and away from the old ideas that once animated the nation, animated the economy, and animated the political landscape. Now this is a slightly longer podcast, so I'll cut this introduction as short as I can, and I'll let Brad explain all the details from here on out. But this is one of those podcasts that I deeply enjoyed myself. There is just so much here, so much to look into, and so much important detail explored in such a fun way that it was an absolute pleasure for myself to have Brad back on the podcast. And I have no doubt that you'll enjoy it too. And of course, Brad's book, Peak Japan, The End of Great Ambitions, is going to be linked below this podcast, and I encourage listeners to go and buy it and read it for themselves. You won't be disappointed. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We don't run advertising in any way. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating to the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And of course, if you have any suggestions for future guests, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll do my best to make it happen. On that, and to talk us through Peak Japan, this is Brad Glosserman. Brad Glosserman, welcome back on the Career Now podcast.
Great, thanks for having me. It's good to hear from you again. Happy New Year. Good luck ducking the coronavirus and whatever salutations are appropriate at this point.
And of course, good luck ducking it over there as well. And the first time we chatted, it was almost 6 months ago now, we talked about Japan and Korea and the trilateral relationship there. But today we're going to focus on your most recent book. Now, we touched on this just slightly in the last podcast, but since then, I'd pre-ordered it at the time. I've had it in my hands now. I've slowly read through it all, and let's jump into it. So your new book here is called Peak Japan, The End of Great Ambitions. And I might get to introduce it slightly here but I might get to do it with this. I suppose what's how you start your book off here, and you're right. It has been the fruit of 27 years. And in some ways, it comes across like this. Often you get these books and you think someone's just had their hands on this and they've written it for a year and they want to pump it out. But this has the feel of almost like a decades-long rumination and I suppose a labor of love in some ways.
Well, a decade of rumination is giving me a lot of credit. One could say that if you hit me hard enough in the head with a certain, things that I'll eventually, some of it will sink in. But I mean, ultimately what that's supposed to mean is that it's the product not only of the actual research that was done, and there was a particular genesis to this project, but it also it draws on all of my experiences since I came to Japan in 1991, and reflects in many ways, and this is something perhaps we can discuss, the overall approach. And I mean, one might say a certain pessimism to my outlook, although that may be a little too strong, and how that's been shaped. But ultimately, it's an attempt to be not only a research, reflection of the research I've done, but as well just a product of the living that I've had in the decades of engagement with Japan. And then in the context of the particulars of the book, what it really, and it's been through 4 different guises. It was actually started in, I think, as I mentioned this in the book, in the March 11th, 2011 earthquake and tsunami and nuclear disaster in Japan. And a foundation came to me and asked if I wanted to try to assess whether this would be a Meiji moment, a moment at which Japan, as it did in the Meiji era, shifted course and would bring about the changing, if you will, in the trajectory of the nation. And so I took up the challenge and proceeded to do the research. And eventually what became, I think, fairly clear was the answer was no. And it's, in retrospect, perhaps very obvious that would have been the case. But at the time, and we can discuss this if you wish, there was a lot of doubt. And there were people saying that this seemed to be an extraordinary opportunity for a country that seemed to be slumped in a slump and absolutely lethargic and stagnant, or so it seemed, to have the excuse or the opportunity to really revitalize itself. And that was a genuine and real conversation about the possibilities. But ultimately, nothing substantive, I think, particularly substantive, happened. And so realizing that no was not going to be a sufficient answer, particularly given the grant I was given, that I needed to explain why or why not Japan was changing. And so the book became an opportunity to explore that.
So we will jump into that. I suppose there is a lot of detail here. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, but there is going to be, I have to apologize from the outset. There is so much here that we're going to have to brush over a little bit just on the content here, but we will get into all those details. But I want to start where your book starts in some ways, and that's with a place that most people might find counterintuitive in some ways. At least when they look at Japan, they think of this wonderful, powerful, strong, outgoing country. And yet you start your book off with a sentence that reads, "Japan is understudied, undervalued, and underappreciated in the analysis and conduct of international relations." So why is that? Why is that the case?
Well, I think for 2 very simple and somewhat related reasons. The first, of course, is that Japan has kind of sunk beneath the waves of international opinion, because for so much of the time, and so much of recent time, the story that we've pretty much heard, except for certain little nuggets and pockets of people that engage on the issues related to Japan, is it's a country that has been marginal to international affairs and pretty much stagnant. I mean, the economy has not grown excessively, and particularly that the comparison between the Japan tale today and the Japan tale when I first moved here in the 1990s, it was a country that was ascendant, a country that seemed to be ready to really take over the world, and that, to be very honest, is not an exaggeration. And yet today, it is not. It's viewed as an afterthought, except in specialist circles. And so that's piece number one. That it's just you have to dig too. It's not an obvious tale. And the second piece of that, which is the flip side, is that the China story is so big. It throws such a huge shadow over everything that's going on in the world that we tend to have a limited attention span. And there's a very easy morality tale, if you will, to tell with China, or a geopolitical tale. And that just absorbs our attention and seems much easier to focus on, and frankly is a more lurid and interesting story to focus on.
So let's jump into a little bit of prehistory, not because this is a book about, this is quite a modern book with a very modern analysis of Japan, but I suppose a touch of history is important just for the context of where Japan is coming from here. And of course, again, you write a very interesting start at the beginning of this first chapter, and you say that in many ways, when you look at Japan, it's a history of trajectories in some ways. It's one that has these great ambitions, and then it is a collapse. So it's this sort of up and down cyclical collapse. And you say, if for any other country in the world, this is a country that Japan are more than capable of understanding. Their history is all about these understandings. You go back to people like Matthew Perry, you run through the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate, the rise of the Meiji order, and of course to where Japan found themselves before the Second World War and all the hope afterwards. So in a very brief history, I suppose, might get you to take us there. And just that idea, this up and down, this hope and collapse within Japanese psychology and history.
Sure. And I hope that I'll be brief, and it is actually a fairly easy story to tell, but your listeners that have that richer understanding have to forgive me for the short version, and that's this. Until 1853, Japan was an isolated country that was largely on the periphery of the Chinese Empire, that saw itself as an independent nation and empire, and decided that it really chose not to engage the outside world. So it had a policy of sakoku, which was isolation. 1853, Commodore Perry shows up and forces open the doors of Japan, forces the country to trade, primarily by virtue of its guns. And one important takeaway is he shows up in these fleet of black ships that pull into Yokohama Harbor or Edo Bay. And to this day, the image of black ships is used to convey a foreign contagion that is coming in and is seen as a threat to the way of life in Japan. So the symbolism of that is remarkable that it continues to this day. So Perry forces the doors open. The country realizes that it is ill-prepared to deal with the West, and then throws off, some enlightened oligarchs throw off the old order of the shogunate and the old emperor, who is essentially a figurehead, and restore the Meiji emperor, hence the name, the Meiji Restoration. And the country, those oligarchs then look at the world and make a very fateful choice. They look at the Asia, which has been historically their order, with China, right, as the center of the Middle Kingdom and the center of the universe. And they look at Asia, realize that it's backward compared to the West, and throw in their lot with the West. So Japan pursues this extraordinary crash modernization and does exceptionally well. So well, in fact, it defeats China, claims Taiwan in 1895, defeats Russia, the first Asian power to ever beat a Western power in the first 5 years of the 20th century. Becomes a great power, and then proceeds to emulate too well the behavior of the West, which means it becomes a brutal and vicious colonialist imperialist. That, of course, leads it into the conflict with the United States and the West more generally, and then devastation and utter destruction in the Pacific War. From those ruins, then, the Japanese are occupied, and then the U.S. changes course, imposes a constitutional order, creates land reform, and pushes the Japanese in this liberal democratic dimension or direction that they do extraordinarily well again. And so you have this incredible economic trajectory, a political system that is democratic, although quite frankly is run it has limits to the expression of its democracy in important ways, and then manages by the end of the Cold War, as I quote Chalmers Johnson, an extraordinary student of Japan, who says the Cold War is over and the Japanese have won. And that's in the early part of the 1990s. And we're thinking the Japanese, it's probably, sorry to say, a little too old for a youngster like yourself and many of your readers, listeners, but the Japanese are really expected to be the leading power of the world. And that doesn't happen. And so what happens in 1991 is Japan enters a period of stagnation. The 90s are called the lost decade. They regain their traction a little bit, and then fall off the cliff in the 2007 and 8 global financial crisis. And then now we're in the period of modern history, and Japan has been making some changes, but not enough that I would argue to keep up with the change that's necessary. And so those are the big waves, right? The growth, the crash, the growth, the stagnation and crash, and trying to understand why, for a country that seems to have done so well at adaptation and forced change, why it doesn't seem to be doing as well today. But that's a very qualified as well, because when you described how Japan is a wonderful place, it is a wonderful place to live. And for all of my criticisms about the adaptation and its future prospects, peak Japan, it's not, I don't see it getting much better than this. It's pretty damn good. It's a really nice place to live. And I urge, folks to visit. And I think it's it's, I've thrown my lot in, at least, is the best way to put it.
And let's drill into the details of that, I suppose, that post-war rise. And you said eventually it hits a peak where they have won the Cold War, and then there's this lost decade, of course. But just before that, and this is going to become important because a lot of this is going to be talking about institutional challenges and mindsets and ways in which Japan might be stuck in the moment. So let's talk about a little bit about that rise and just how they did it. And you're right here, there's something important that they jumped on here at the time. They had a single-minded bureaucracy working hand in hand with ambitious political class and determined business sector to fuse a large homogeneous society with an ancient culture to then rewrite the rules of capitalism. So they didn't just embrace what the world had out there. They took what they had and sort of fused it together. So I might get you to jump in there and build up this idea of just how Japan were so successful, at least in their own ideas and economic theory post Second World War.
Well, I mean, I think what the Japanese have is like, it's hard to build on or otherwise qualify what I said. I wrote that really well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've just sprained my shoulder patting myself on my back. You have an incredibly ambitious people. I mean, what the Japanese had from the Meiji era onward was the capacity to mobilize the population in pursuit of national goals in great ways. And, in the post-war era, you did have politicians who felt as though Japan is destined to greatness. And you had business people who saw their role in that as creating a strong economy. Rich nation and strong army is the way that Dick Samuels, the Japanese scholar, formulated it. That, the strength of the country ultimately was reflected in both its unity of the population and the capacity to generate wealth and prosperity. What the Japanese had, I think, was a culture that truly valued harmony, valued all contributions, and gave everyone a place within that society and that effort where they could feel as though they were contributing. And that, you have to be careful you slide too far down the path of cultural determinism. But I think there's something to be said for the way that Japanese culture tries to value all of the individuals that are part of it. And that there's no job that is not worth doing, and if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. And that's something we in the West, I think, need to appreciate. And it is the value that was attached to all of the individuals and the ability for all of them to feel as though they were engaged in shared sacrifice. The fact that at times 95% of Japanese would all call themselves middle class, which is pretty remarkable, I think testifies to the strength of this notion of homogeneity and sense of common purpose. And there were certain advantages that were eked out that were part of that, right? The fact that the United States provided the security umbrella and the great inequality and the obligations of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and this takes us into contemporary politics as well. But the idea that the Japanese just didn't have to devote much of their national resources, such as they were in the 50s and 60s, to defense, and thus could devote them to more productive enterprises, like really creating an industrial infrastructure. The fact that the Japanese government was prepared to dampen down consumer sentiment and focus on production, to build up rather than the individual, the larger companies that were, I think, rightfully seen as the key contributors to the economy. And they were facilitated in this, quite frankly, in thinking about the U.S. side, that suggested it was more important to keep Japan on side in the Cold War competition, so they were prepared to swallow certain unhappinesses about trade flows, et cetera, because the idea was we wanted to keep the Japanese on our side of the ledger. That's shifted, obviously, in the last couple of decades, but nonetheless, those two provided real advantages to the Japanese attempts to build a strong economy. And so I think you put the cultural dimension, you put a stable political system, essentially, and a subset of that too. And forgive me if I'm kind of jumping around, because it's never had to quite put it. It's difficult to condense all of this, I think, into a relatively short exposition. But also, on the political piece, because everyone looked at themselves as being genuinely motivated by a national purpose and a notion of cultural harmony, you don't have the extraordinary corruption that's so typified many other countries that may have found themselves in similar situations. You had some, of course, but nonetheless, you had a greater devotion to national purpose and I think a greater capacity to move toward and realize that goal.
So, and of course, as we move forward here, we talked about the rise and we talked about the bust. And in all of this, one of the fundamental things that we're going to talk about is leadership and the way modern leadership and the challenges of the prime ministerial office have been over the years. But one of the key figures in this, if we stretch back just a little bit, is Prime Minister Kazumi. And Kazumi. And he sits there as this, I suppose, this figure that people didn't expect a lot of when he came in. And he comes in with a very interesting, national identity and national understanding, where he insists that he will pledge and visit the Yasukuni Shrine every year. And at the same time, he pushes forward these neoliberal reform packages. And of course, both these things are going to become vitally important later on. And we're going to get to Shinzo Abe in his second term later on in this interview as well. But who was he and why does he become such an interesting figure? And how does he separate himself as a leader from people who came before him and those after him and that political landscape inside Japanese politics?
I think there's two interesting questions there, Jed. The first is the degree to which we credit Kazumi, and I think sadly that's a function of a generational thing. I mean, there are people in the history of Japan, or modern history, contemporary history of Japan, that are far more, I think, important figures in certain ways. So you have Ikeda, who was the prime minister in the 1960s, or who decides that the question of security, Japan's security role and tackling security issues in domestic politics was far too contentious. Instead, focuses on economic growth and the famous income doubling plan. And what that does is sets a model for Japan. He says in a decade we're going to double the national income, and does it in 8 years, which at the time was extraordinary in the 1960s. No country had done that before. And that becomes the basis of both Japan's international status, its standing, its growth, its power in the world. And the degree to which Japan is the success story is really the cornerstone of its international role, its image. And so, people would look at that as he was a critical player. In the 1970s, you had a Prime Minister Tanaka who turns the LDP into this incredible money-making machine, consolidates its control in ways that had really never been done before. He is a seminal figure. A Prime Minister Fukuda, who is responsible for what's called the Fukuda Doctrine, which essentially kind of attempts to recast Japan's relationship with Southeast Asia from one that was largely a function of memories of the war and the war experience, the Pacific War, to one that's seen more as a partnership, although there are limits to how far you go with that. And then you have Prime Minister Nakasone in the 1980s, who really stands tall with President Reagan, the Iran-Yasu relationship. And so he creates this image of Japan as one that is ready or beginning to think about itself in more, as a security provider in ways that were just utterly anathema to his predecessors and in many ways to many other politicians in Japan and the public at the time. So, and then he's followed by what is basically a prime minister for every 9 months until Koizumi comes to power. And so I think it is Koizumi's tendency to loom large in the imagination as we think about Japanese politics is a reflection, I think, of a certain generational perspective and one that's kind of ahistorical. But he is a neat figure. And that goes to the second part of your question, which is why is he such a neat figure? First of all, because he stayed in power for 5.5, 6 years, whereas his predecessors basically lasted an average of about, like I said, 9 or 10 months. Number two, he was an individual. I mean, this was a guy who really did weird stuff by Japanese standards, like to sing karaoke, had this huge flowing mane of hair. He was prepared to really be a person as opposed to a colorless, odorless, tasteless politician, which most Japanese prime ministers had been before. This was a country that was famously known as a karaoke democracy. And, and that was the line where it didn't really matter, as in karaoke, who was singing, because someone handed you a script and you just sang the music, and it was the singer was interchangeable. Japanese prime ministers were interchangeable because the bureaucracy and the party infrastructure, the Liberal Democratic Party infrastructure, ran the country. And Koizumi changed that. So he has this image. He was very close to President Bush. at the time of the September 11th terrorist incidents. He stood next to him and he made statements. Japan will stand with you, which no Japanese had ever said before to an American president, and no Japanese had said that before to the Japanese people. It was a statement of purpose that was just that really made people stand up, and he was happy, and he built his political bona fides on his readiness to be an individual. And that was just so anti-Japanese. Now, to be very honest, if you look at his record of accomplishment, there's less there than meets the eye. The attitudes and the image that he projected was great. The tangible accomplishments, not so much. You look at some of his economic agenda. He was big at passing legislation or checking a box, not so good at seeing it implemented. And so I think in some ways he gets a lot of credit for reformism when in fact what he really promoted was the image of reform. And once he left power, and because interestingly enough, he had declared war against his own party, because he was such a radical reformer, many people within the Liberal Democratic Party, his party, many politicians were not prepared to vote for him. So he would run candidates, not unlike, for example, the Tea Party in the US, where the extreme right of the Republican Party would run against moderate conservatives. Well, Koizumi ran his own radical reformers, assassins he called them, against old party members of his own party that didn't support his agenda. The difference, though, is that once he left power, a lot of those old guys came back, and they were brought back into the party, even after he'd kicked them out by people like the first-term Prime Minister Abe. And thus, a lot of his great steps forward, tangible accomplishments, were undone or left undone. And thus, I think we have to be careful about making sure that we understand appropriately the Koizumi legacy.
So let's step just beyond Kazumi after he leaves office. And you're right that despite all that, he has two legacies here. You're right, political stability and economic recovery. Now, how superficial it is and how real it is, it's there. But this is the legacy he leaves Japan. And then suddenly the world is hit by the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So I might get you to open up that moment for us in Japanese history and just what it does, because you're right here. Many people may not know this about Japan, but they weren't directly affected by the collapse of the subprime crisis. But of course, this spreads to them as it becomes a contagion around the world in many other ways. So I might get you to take us there.
Sure. There were two dimensions to the global financial crisis, as you said. First were, of course, the immediate hit for the financial institutions that were holding the collateralized debt obligations, which were, the financial chicanery that brought down the U.S. banks and the financial system. But the second wave of that was when economies contracted around the world as they tried to deal with that. That, not the first. The Japanese had very few of those CDOs. The Japanese were largely insulated because, frankly, they were fairly unsophisticated players in the global financial markets and stuck to old-style investing. So they were largely immune, but they were still an old-style industrial manufacturing exporting economy, or at least that's where so much of their growth and their prospects were reliant. And thus, as those other economies shut down, the Japanese got hammered. So they got nailed in the second wave. But it's also important to notice that the problems that the Japanese were facing, I said there were two legacies: economic stability and political stability, or economic recovery and political stability. The problem is that the first of those was undone almost instantly. So Koizumi leaves office after 5.5, 6 years in the Kante, the prime minister's office. Prime Minister Abe becomes his successor. He's out within a year. And then in less time than that, his successor, Fukuda, is out. And then his successor is out in less than a year, is Prime Minister Aso, who also is now the deputy prime minister under Abe and the finance minister as well. So the political stability piece is gone before the financial crisis. And then you have the global financial crisis, and that essentially wipes out all of the gains that Koizumi had provided and the sense of trust and respect for and competence in the LDP leadership. So at that point, the Japanese public says, we've had enough. For the first time, really, in modern contemporary Japanese political history, we're going to vote the opposition into office. And that happens in 2009.
So you mentioned there a couple of times, and we've touched on it a little bit here, of this a prime ministerial merry-go-round of sorts, this nine months in office and then leaving. And it is important, I suppose, here to open that up a little bit. Just why is this happening? For many people listening, they will think, why on earth would a prime minister last a year and then be removed, a year then be removed? So I guess the question begs some analysis of the institutions, the attitudes, the scandals, but also the parliamentary system and just how it works.
No, that's a long discussion. I mean, but I mean, the short version becomes Abe is in office, succeeds Kazumi. There are 4 scandals. 4 cabinet ministers of his are taken down by scandals and forced to resign. 1 commits suicide. He also has what had been suspected and ultimately confirmed later. He had some serious health problems, and the party was losing elections, which typically is what happens. You have a sense that the political fortunes of national party is tied either to a local election, a by-election, or they've lost some other election. And it becomes clear that you need a change in leadership to try to restore some of the energy, enthusiasm to the governing party. So after a year, Abe is racked by scandals. He's completely ineffectual. The public opinion numbers are disastrous. And you also remember, have a sense that you have a political system in which the bureaucrats can keep the ship of state afloat. And you have a superstructure that, or an infrastructure, both probably, that really will keep, that are what move the country and the political system forward. And thus you don't really have to worry about the particular face of the prime minister. And so the winds are all going against Abe. He decides to do, as in the Japanese case, the honorable thing, which is to take responsibility and resign. He's succeeded by another prime minister who then proves to be equally ineffectual, bereft of ideas, incapable of turning the country around. He gets creamed in an election as well, because there are 2 houses of parliament: the lower house, which is where you have is the real power, and the upper house, which is not as powerful as the lower, but nonetheless, apparently in parliamentary democracies, one of the most powerful in the world. So the opposition takes control of the upper house, and with that control proves pretty capable of stymieing almost every government initiative in the lower house. So even though you've got a governing majority and the control of the prime minister's office, you really aren't capable of getting legislation through. So Abe's successor proves to be ineffectual, politically radioactive, and he realizes too that he's not getting anything done. He's utterly stymied, decides to do the honorable thing and pass on the baton and see if in fact another politician can somehow or other rejuvenate the party. He steps down. That his successor proves to be equally ineffectual, if not more so, prone to gaffes, unpopular. The country goes into an election in the summer of 2009, and they lose for the first time, like I said, in modern history, with a footnote in one other election. But essentially, the LDP loses power, and the Democratic Party of Japan comes to office in 2009.
So I'm beginning to feel a little guilty here with the questions I'm asking, as I'm realizing that each question I'm bringing through is about 50 pages of your book, and I'm summarizing them to a question, and you've got about 5 minutes to answer each one. So from that, I do apologize, and I apologize.
I was going to apologize for going on and on about this.
No. Well, if you thought they were bad so far, wait for the next question. This is going to be one that is going to be very tricky to summarize in the time, and it runs through the theme of all your book here. But it is fundamentally important, I think. Many people out there simply don't have an understanding for why Japan hit the bubble, why it stopped growing, why it is where it is. And I suppose it comes to questions. I suppose it's a simple question: why did Japan stop growing? And you bring through a few factors in this. You talk about in some ways the economic catch-up was simply over. They hit the end of that cycle. The Bretton Woods system had ended, and then they lost all the benefits that came from that. And Japan's demographic profile had shifted. And of course, through all of this is things such as a long-running deflation inside the country and excess capacity. So why did Japan, in short, why did it stop growing in the way that many people expected it would?
Let me say this with all due respect, but you bastard. You've conflated and thrown a lot of stew into that mix. I mean, let's you got to go back, and forgive me, I'm not an economist, and working on this has been really fascinating. Let me, before I answer that question, let me try to, if I will, let me maybe go back to the structure of the book a little bit, because that might help kind of reveal, I think, what some of the way to think about these problems. The book is set up, right, to answer the question why Japan is where it is today, and why I think that it's at the apogee of its international power and influence, all things being equal. And that's an important asterisk. You might want to go back to that. But, so I set up the history. The second chapter says, I look at what I call a series of shocks, and each shock is intended to explore particular dimensions of the Japanese story. So the first stop is 2007. It's the economic shock of or actually 2007-8. So I think technically I call it 2008, which is the Lehman shock, and that's the economics. And so what I try to do in that chapter is answer exactly the question you just asked, and I'll come back to it. The next chapter is what I call the Seiji, which is the Japanese word for political shock. Seiji shoku, so the political shock. So that happens in 2009 when the LDP loses power, which is the previous question you just asked. And I try to then explain the political system, both what has happened as well as the structural issues at work in the political system. Then the fifth chapter, I think it is we're at now, is what I call the Senkaku shoku, which again, I just like alliteration. And the Senkakus are these islands that are disputed claimed by both Japan and China in the East China Sea. And what I use that is because in 2010, there was a standoff between the two countries over the arrest of a fishing boat captain, a Chinese fishing boat captain who was in those waters. And so what I try to do is use that as the vehicle to explore Japan's relations with its neighbors, its foreign policy. And then in 2011, you have what I call it's the March 11th, the Fukushima accident, which is an attempt to explore Japan's national identity in terms of its relationship to science, technology, how it thinks itself, its response to that particular crisis as a way of exploring that dimension of Japan. And then, and that's to my mind, one of the richest and most interesting chapters. I'm sure you'll ask me a long and meandering question about it eventually.
Absolutely, yes.
I know it's coming. And then, the sixth chapter is an attempt to say, all right, then Abe comes back to power. How do we look at what I call the Abe interregnum, which is from 2012, the end of 2012, at the beginning of 2013, when DPJ gets kicked out of power, when Abe is reelected in December of that year, and then in how his performance and record in office until I guess it was the summer of 2018 when I stopped working and revising the book. And then the final chapter, chapter 7, says, what are the lessons we draw from that? How do we evaluate the Abe years in the context of through each of those windows that I'd identified: economics, politics, foreign policy, and national identity. And then that leads me to the conclusions that I make. So I think, for your readers, if the structure of the book really addresses precisely the questions you're asking. And so it offers a far more coherent take on that than I'm prepared, than I can give you here. And just as a kind of an aside, it's interesting, when the book came out, I was doing about a book launch event every 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Finally, by the time I was doing the fifth or sixth one, I got the spiel down pretty good. It's amazing how, and this is the first time I've talked about the book in quite a while. I'm always available, of course, to do that if any of your listeners want to have the chat. But it's just interesting how over time, it's only when you're just reaching the end of one's engagement with a problem that one actually figures out what you're doing with it and how you do it well. So it's a way of kind of apologizing. I'm rusty talking about this stuff, and I hope that it's not going to prove to be too incoherent. But back to the economy. So, the Japanese had created, I think, a very particular economic model that had been incredibly successful. And it was an export-driven model that forced outward-oriented companies to engage with the finest companies in the world and really become competitive. Excellent products, whether it was Toyota, whether it was Sony, etc. It was a function, however, very much of the Cold War, in which the United States was inclined to look askance, the United States was inclined to let the Japanese protectionism go, again, as I'd said, to keep it on side during the Cold War. So there was Japanese, if you will, to call it politely, misbehaviors that were involved in the protection of its domestic economy, the forced transfer of technology, et cetera, that we would not tolerate today, but we're prepared to do. And the Japanese exploited that extremely well. And they built this incredible export machine that ultimately, as Richard Katz argues in The System That Soured, subsidized the inefficient parts of the economy domestically. And then in the 1980s, the Japanese are the beneficiaries of some, I think, larger economic miscalculations. When the G7, for example, goes with the Plaza Accord and cuts the value of the currency in an attempt to make the Japanese more, or less competitive, if you will, to cut the value of the currency in half. What they ultimately did, however, was double the size of the Japanese bank accounts. And the Japanese proved, by virtue of their culture, their political practices, their economic practices, able to become even more efficient economically. And so you just doubled their wealth and forced them to make adjustments that they were uniquely able to do in their economic sphere. And so their companies became even leaner and tougher and harder to compete with, instead of just becoming, suddenly their products became more competitive, or less competitive, and more expensive on international markets. It forced the Japanese into Southeast Asia to find cheaper labor and cheaper inputs, which they did, which promoted Japanese interests in the region and helped overcome some of the legacies of the war. Again, to go back to my earlier comments about the Fukuda Doctrine. At home, it created great inflation, and it essentially was promoted in the real estate myth, the idea that Japanese property would never lose its value. And so you had extraordinary and unrealistic and fantastical assessments of value. So the famous ones are that, for anyone that's been to Tokyo, right in the heart of the city is the Imperial Palace, which is, I think if you jog, you run around the Imperial Castle, around the moat, it's, I think, a 5-kilometer run. Maybe it might be 3, might be 5, I can't remember. But the value on paper of the land that within that little circle was valued as worth all of that of California. And it was realistic. I mean, that was the way that people were lending money based on that real estate valuation. All of the land in Japan was, in theory, worth more than all of the real estate values of the world by that formula, right? And banks were lending money on those valuations. It were absurd. And the Bank of Japan realized that around 1989 and decides that we've got to slow down this tendency of people to value real estate, always assume that it's going to go up, and then borrow money on the basis of an inflated valuation. We need to make it harder to borrow, and thus we've got to raise interest rates, et cetera. And what happened then was that all of these financial institutions, and because the Japanese economy is so interlinked, that it was more than just financial. It wasn't just banks; it was insurance companies, it was corporate entities that all owned shares in this, in banks and financial institutions, or that had loans that you had used land as collateral, suddenly found themselves with loans that far outstripped the capacity to repay. Right? They didn't have a sound financial basis, and thus, but rather than close out these loans, the Japanese, because they had a mindset that said, we believe in a society of WA, we all pull together, we're never going to pull the rug out from under our weakest members, we're going to keep them alive. And thus what happened is you had the creation of, most famously, what are called the zombie companies. All of these companies that in a ruthlessly efficient market economy would have gone bankrupt and would have been closed, and all these people the employees would have been forced onto the market. The Japanese said, we don't do that. We're going to keep these companies alive to ensure that these people have livelihoods, because that is the nature of a society in which we all pull together. It's not about the enrichment of the few that are efficient. That those companies stayed alive when perhaps they shouldn't have, and that they produced enough goods or provided enough services that ultimately weakened the healthy companies. And so the zombies infected and took down and dampened to extraordinary levels the healthy companies. So that is, I think, what most people would say is the biggest problem in the Japanese economy. But at the same time, you also had slowing economic growth. You had an inverted demographic pyramid, where rather than having a large base of young people that would be taking jobs and then paying pensions and paying taxes, et cetera, to support retirees, it was the other way around. You had far more retirees and older folks than you did young people. So there's no way to support the pensions. And you had, by virtue of the decisions that reflected both economic and political considerations, the greatest national debt in Japan of any country, not even just I suppose the Zimbabweans are worse. But we talked about Greece when it's with its crises about 10 years ago. Japanese total national debt is worse than that of Greece. And so somewhere, somehow, sometime, that money had to be paid back. And yet you had to do it with an economy that was increasingly sluggish and with a demographic situation that was going to make it difficult, if not impossible. And you were going to have increasingly sharpened choices. We always talk about the famous choice between guns and butter, right? Where an economy and a society has to choose, like, are we going to provide for the national defense, which is in many ways an asset that does not return a reward other than the kind of the intangible asset of security, versus productive economic assets, right? You can either you can build a plant or you can build an aircraft carrier. And in theory, the plant actually is going to be better for your economy than the aircraft carrier. Well, for the Japanese, the choice isn't so much in the future between guns and butter, it's between guns and wheelchairs. Are they going to live up to the ambitions of the current leadership, which is, and assume a larger role providing international security or regional security to the world? Are they going to pay for that? Are they going to buy the flat tops, the helicopter carriers? Are they going to bring more people, more modern defense capabilities? Or are they actually going to provide the medical care for the increasing number of retirees in the society? That's the choice that the Japanese have to face. And it's been incredibly clear, and it's a choice that they've not been ready to make. They keep fudging on it. And that, of course, is an invitation for you to ask me about my conclusions at some point. But I think that's really the structural problems, which are the zombies, the debt, and the demographics. Those are really, really the biggest issues that Japan faces in its economy. Did that lay it out for you?
That was pretty comprehensive, yeah, I must admit. Let's step forward then. Let's get closer to some of those conclusions, to some of the later paragraphs in your book. And of course, as you mentioned at the very start, one of the most fundamental things, one of the most fundamental impetuses for you to write this was the earthquake and tsunami in 2011. So let's take us to that moment and its impact on Japanese society and just what it did to the psyche. And of course, for people that outside Japan, like myself, I was unaware of this, but for all the disaster that happened on the ground, many people saw it as a moment or a potential moment for the great rebirth of the country. There's one catastrophe in which a country could regalvanize itself, find its collective identity again, and reemerge in a way that it had been wanting to for many years, and politicians have been talking about for many years, but they just failed to do.
Put a pin in that wanting to, right? The idea, be careful about, and this is one of the key messages of the book, is that the talk about revitalization is one thing. Everybody, of course, wants to be rich and healthy and happy, etc. The question is invariably, what are you prepared to do to accomplish that? I don't care if we're talking about a country or just an individual. I want to be thinner and better looking, and I seem to be sleeping late, not getting up early and going out for my morning run. That willingness, readiness to change is really the fulcrum of my book. And I think that's the most important piece. But to go back to March 11, so you have an earthquake and tsunami and a nuclear meltdown, the worst in probably, you can say whether Chernobyl was worse, but I probably not. And it struck at Japan in some really important ways. First of all, obviously, it was the 19,000 people that were killed or missing. That's a pretty extraordinary death toll. However, mind you, it could have been much, much, much worse. At one point, they were talking about 30,000. For a disaster of that magnitude, I think it is a testimony in many ways to how well prepared, in some respects, the Japanese were. That it was confined to the way it was for catastrophic events like that. Secondly, hundreds of billions of dollars of damage that was done. 5% of the economy was lost, I think is the number, although it's even disputed and it's hard to say. But at least that 5% of the Japanese economy, GDP, was lost. Equally important, which is why I put it in this chapter on national identity, it was a blow to the Japanese conceptions of who they were, their capacity both to handle a crisis of that magnitude and of the faith in technology that had been so much a piece of Japanese national identity, right? This idea that they'd been told for years, despite being the only country to ever have been suffer the atomic bomb twice in World War II, which meant that, of course, nuclear power was incredibly contentious. Instead, what we had was the creation of a myth of nuclear safety that said, it's okay, we've got this mastered, it's under control. everything, you can trust us. And in fact, as it became clear and in the subsequent investigations, which I go to in considerable depth in the book, the Japanese public had been lied to, and they had been put up upon by an unholy triumvirate of nuclear power supporters, of the bureaucracy, and of politicians who were prepared to hoist a fiction upon the people about how safe nuclear power was. And I'm not sure that on one level we should all know that there is no ultimate safety. And I mean, there's lessons to be gleaned from this, I think, in all sorts of different ways today and in all sorts of different places, right? But you cannot pretend that the risk is zero, and it's about managing risk and being honest with publics when those inevitable mishaps occur. The Japanese were not leveled with, and that was a shocking blow to them. And of course, the political incompetence of the actual response to the disaster, and a lot of that's laid at the feet of the government, which was this new government, the Democratic Party of Japan. I would suggest that, in fact, it had inherited the crisis response mechanisms. It had inherited the problems. It may not have been experienced, but I do not believe the LDP would have been much better. If it had been in power, it probably would have performed as poorly. It might have put on a better PR show, but it certainly, I don't think, would have handled it any better. So all of that leads to this question, deep questioning in the Japanese mind about who we are, what we're doing, how much now of the things that we've believed about our nation, our political system, our identity as Japanese, our mastery of technology, and our relationship to nature, etc. How much of this do we need to rethink? And for some opportunists, and I say that in a good way, they're thinking this is the moment in which we can suddenly push through the changes that we know are needed. And again, in the book, I go through a lot of these, what I call, these visions and strategies, and it looked like every 6 months. And since I believe I start with the one of the commissions, prime ministerial commissions in 1999, where they're always talking about Japan faces an imminent crisis. We're at a crossroads. We must change, or we will become irrelevant and sink beneath the seas. And there's all of this hand-wringing and crisis mongering, and nothing ever gets done. And every few years, we see another version of this, and not just from think tankers like myself, where we're paid to use adjectives and adverbs to get attention. These are from what I call the apex organizations of the state. These are from places like Keidanren, the Federation of Japanese Business Associations, which are where all the chief business executives are. Keizai Doyukai, which is the Federation of Japanese Business Executives. From METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. From these these new national planning units, which are cabinet level offices. They all are decrying a country that must adapt and change in radical ways to be ready for the challenges of the 21st century. And the fact that they're throwing these out every other year suggests they're not making any progress. And again, you have one of those reports coming out after March 11th. And again, so people were talking at that time. And I go into it a little bit, but I mostly refer to Dick Samuel's work because he wrote a brilliant book on 311 titled 311, interestingly enough, where he has great in-depth work on, a content analysis of all of this work in Japanese, and that talks about how we're really trying, we as a country, this is our moment, this is the chance we have to change. And ultimately it peters out for a bunch of different reasons.
Well, there is a question in that, and this comes to some of your conclusions, which we are coming to, I promise. This is...
I'm okay with this. It's your listeners that are probably gasping for air and looking
I'm sure they're riveted. Don't worry about it. There's a theme that runs through all this, which is quite fascinating, and it's a cultural theme about Japanese society and how they see themselves. And of course, this has always been, or at least tend to have been, a collectivist mindset. At least that's what has been projected out there. And I'm going to come to a very blunt statement of yours in your book, which is quite interesting at this period, because after this disaster, many people are trying to bring the country back together and fuse it together and to grow, as I mentioned earlier, and as you just said there. And you write here, in very blunt terms, in one simple sentence, the failure of Japan to come together at this moment, and here I quote you write, the Japanese did not feel tied to each other, end of sentence. And that is a very interesting thought, that this country that had always thought of itself as a collectivized nation, lots of importance on harmony and things like this, suddenly realized that all that talk of collectivization and this collective mindset was something of the past, and that they no longer actually had it when this moment really called for it.
It's interesting that you use that. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a good sentence, damn it. And I think I was borrowing it from a commentator who wrote an essay called "Disaster Tore Us Apart." And let me, there's a couple of dimensions to this that I think are worth really exploring. The first is, as you said, it was a belief among the Japanese that they were all the same. And what Kazumi, the commentator who I'm quoting, who wrote that essay, really thoughtful guy, says is that the Japanese looked at what happened on March 11th, and they couldn't explain why some of them suffered, and some Japanese suffered and others didn't. It was completely random. It was utterly probabilistic. You lived in a certain place, or you were at home on a certain time, and your life was ended. And if you were fortunate enough to be somewhere else, even if you lived in one of those villages and you didn't happen to be in the village on that day that was absolutely destroyed by the tsunami, well, your life went on. And that notion of randomness, in some senses, was an absolute wedge for the Japanese. And it forced them to realize that they weren't one country. And, one of I say this, that came out, I think, exceptionally well in these roundtables I did with Japanese students. One of the most fascinating pieces of the book, most fun, not fascinating, certainly the research, was I went around the country and I did a series of roundtables with students. I did, I think, 2 in Tokyo, 2 in Kyoto, 1 in Osaka, maybe. Yeah. And the students would say they were really smart and very interesting and very intelligent. And they would say, some of them, I was overseas, I saw the news, I felt I had to come home and be a Japanese. Others said, I saw this happen far away, and it didn't feel to me, I felt no more connected to this than I did to, say, a disaster in the Philippines. And I mentioned in the book as well that there was this sense that, the country felt as though we had to come together. There was this thing, the word called kizuna, right? Bonds and ties is what it means. And so the Japanese prime minister was saying, in the effort of kizuna, we're going to end the cherry blossom viewing parties. We won't hold them. And we're going to, we all need to turn down off the air conditioning, and we need to turn down the electricity, both as a practical measure, but to show solidarity. And these students said, that's nonsense. This doesn't do anything. It's feel good, and it really doesn't promote a connection. And I thought was some of the most interesting and revealing statements about both the nature of the country and the nature of the young. It's not that they were uncaring and unfeeling, because there was some real volunteerism and some real efforts to go out. But there was also this sense of that a hard-eyed realism about the nature of the state and the nature of the society within which they lived. And this idea that they saw through some of the myths. They saw through this notion that we're all in this together. Well, actually, no, we're not. Some of us, we're prepared to make some sacrifices and to do some things, but some of us aren't. And some of us feel no more connection to this than we would to any other disaster anywhere else in the world. And I think that matters a lot, because certainly, one of the hallmarks of Japan in the last 100-something years has been this willingness to all make shared sacrifices. And one of the extrapolations from those conversations, and is evident in other data, I think, is young Japanese today have looked around and they've said, we saw the sacrifices that our parents made and our grandparents made to build a rich and prosperous country. And we see the life they live, and we're not really prepared to do that anymore. We are kind of comfortable, and we want to live our own lives, and we do not want to subordinate ourselves to the larger society if that really truly risks inconveniencing us. And that's a crude and somewhat provocative way to put it, but I think that's a fairly accurate reflection. Now, there is, interestingly, a flip side to this, which I think I want to mention because it's really important, about this notion at the same time of social resilience and of this idea of harmony, where people may not be prepared to suffer as one, but they're also not prepared, if you will, to stand up and demand change. So there's a limit to how far one goes on the spectrum. So what you end up with, as one politician said to me, our resilience the extraordinary strength we show, the composure in crisis situations like this, is an absolute break on change. It prevents us from saying enough is enough. You have to do something about this. Instead, we gambaru, right? We struggle through. We keep a stiff upper lip, and we are composed, and we are dignified, and we suffer in silence.
So that is actually a wonderful segue into the return of Shinzo Abe, not for the Abenomics, which of course we can touch on here, but a very interesting thought that it hadn't occurred to me very clearly in my mind. I'm sure it was there, but this understanding of where Japan see themselves in terms of foreign policy. And you write a lot throughout this book about the way that Japanese see themselves as a creator and an upholder of international institutions. So you write here in some ways that they want to be an architect of the world, and they are in the same sense it's a rejection of, and you quote here, Hobbesian anarchism. And it's an interesting thought based on what you just said there, that this country, and of course we haven't mentioned it much, but limited in terms of their constitution and how they project power around the world. A country like this, its foreign policy must in some way, if it wants to have an international projection this way, must follow these norms. So I might get you to touch on the return of Shinzo Abe and foreign policy and just where Japan find themselves and how their outlook for this foreign policy is going to be over the next few years.
Sure. Again, unfortunately, got to go back before Abe. And I think the point, to give you the again, this is brief and abbreviated. The issue is Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution says that Japan will forswears the use of war as an instrument of state policy. We will not wage a war against other countries. Period. And sentence 2 says, as a result of that, we forswear the instruments of war making. So to this day, Japan does not have an army, navy, or an air force. It has a ground self-defense force. It has an air self-defense force, and it has a maritime self-defense force. And we can talk about the constitutional debate in Japan. But what that has meant, therefore, is one, Japanese have by and large depended on the United States for security and protection. And two, that it has had to promote its security through other means. So this goes back again to the engagement with Southeast Asia I talked about earlier. And the famous Prime Minister Fukuda, who I mentioned very, very briefly, the first Fukuda, who said, we need, if our country, if our economy is going to be strong, we need to have better relations with Southeast Asia because we need to build our factories there because our prices are getting too high. So we need to create a new relationship, a partnership with the countries of Southeast Asia. Similarly, we need to engage with the Chinese, and that's a separate topic, but is piece of this, the degree to which the Japanese have always felt that they've needed a relationship with China that was fundamentally different from that of the United States in some important ways. And so the Japanese had worked on creating, if you will, institutions of order that were not militarily based on law, based on institutions, the creation of the United Nations. So, I wrote that at the end of the Cold War in 1991, they see this George H.W. Bush has put together this international coalition to defeat Saddam Hussein, and all these countries have come together in the United Nations, and they're thinking, if this is going to work, if this is going to be the way the world is going to work, no country is better suited for this than us. Because we have money, we have power, we have never played up the military dimension. We believe in the United Nations. We believe in international law. And so that's where they are putting their money. And unfortunately, that dream of a new world order, which is actually what H.W. Bush called it at the time that they repulsed Saddam Hussein in Kuwait, that fell apart, right? And there's all sorts of domestic and foreign crises within Asia that just totally, tear down the dream. And the Japanese are forced to think about security in different terms. And but throughout, they have tried to work within the constitutional framework. They've never had a prime minister who seemed to be as driven to rewrite the Constitution. The Japanese Constitution has never been amended since it was promulgated at the end of World War II. Has ever been as committed to doing that. And so to work within that framework has required creativity and energy. So the Japanese, of course, pushed a number of institutional mechanisms. For example, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation was in many ways a Japanese idea, and the Japanese pushed the Australians forward to really take the credit and to do some of the heavy lifting. But they were they were behind that. It was originally their idea. They have put forward other suggestions that at various times were shot down, and one could argue about the tactics and the strategy. The idea of creating an East Asian economic or Asian monetary fund, in the 1997 Asian financial crisis. The Japanese discussed that. The efforts that Abe has taken up in the wake of his desire to do more for regional security has been reflected both this notion, as he puts it, you're either a rule taker or rule maker. Either you create the rules of the international or regional environment, or you're subject to them. And Abe has been aggressive in pursuit of a vision to shape the international order in the ways that few of his predecessors have, primarily because they felt as though that working with many of his predecessors said, we're going to, of course, work with regional countries, but our primary partnership is the United States. And the way that we really work on security concerns is through our alliance with the U.S.
So let's jump into your final chapter here, and we can blend Shinzo Abe into it and his return as well. And this is going to narrow in on the central thesis of the book, which is quite fascinating here. And I'm going to start with a little bit about Shinzo Abe. And you start this chapter with a simple sentence, and you write, Japan's lost decades are over. And then later in the book, you quote an economist who says, despite Abenomics, which we haven't touched on, of course, and of course it's a whole topic for a whole different podcast, of course, but you quote this economist, and he writes, despite what this has done, and despite it being a fundamental reform package, it is not distinctly different from the reforms of Abe's predecessors. And this is an interesting thing that you write. You say, for all Abe's gallant return and all the euphoria and all the big policies, it's just provided a floor for Japan. It hasn't actually improved much.
Yes, I did say that. Actually, I quoted him for saying it. I mean, sorry, I couldn't resist. Their Abenomics consisted of three eras, they famously called it. One was essentially fiscal stimulus, which was is a long-standing Japanese policy. Every time your economy is stuttering, you pump out a lot of money, which is why it's got the debt that it does. Abe did that and did it quite successfully, but very traditional. Second was quantitative easing, and that is that the Bank of Japan printed yen like crazy, and that was unconventional. And in fact, the Bank of Japan was quite ambivalent at some points about doing that, and remains ambivalent because of the fear that it was going to create massive, the country be awash in yen and would create at some point massive inflation. That has not happened. Japan, you still have almost zero inflation in the country. It's really quite remarkable. But the third piece was the structural reform. And the idea is that you created the stimulus and the quantitative easing to create conditions that would make change easier. It would lessen the impact of that. Always that if you're going to do hard things, you do it when the economy is in good position, not bad, because you've got a bigger shock absorber. Well, the structural reforms have been more in name than in reality. And of course, I'm not suggesting they've never happened, but they've never happened at the quantity and at the volume and at the pace and the scale that would, I think, constitute a genuine restructuring of the economy. And what was interesting was that the notion, they're called three arrows because there's a famous story that practically every society has that says, take these three arrows, break them individually, try to break them individually you can, put the three together, and they're impossible to break. And that's, in fact, the idea was you do all three of these things together, except the Japanese haven't. The structural reform piece is lagging. And thus, what has not occurred is the attempts to modernize the economy in ways that would better prepare Japan for the structural challenges, to deal with the demographic shift, to deal with the shrinking population, to deal with the deficits. And this is where I've got to be very, very careful. Because people, the most constant criticism I get from the book is that you're calling on Japan to change. You want the Japanese economy and society to be different, and how dare you? And, because it works so well. This is such a beautiful country, and everything is comfortable and efficient and clean, and so many Michelin stars. And B, you're not Japanese. It's not your country. And my answer is, I haven't called on the Japanese to change. My feeling is that I enjoy this country, and it is beautiful and efficient and clean. It's got its problems, but nonetheless, it works better than most, if not almost every other society in the world. However, the rest of the world is changing very rapidly. And while the Japanese are probably not a basket case, or definitely not a basket case by any measure, and there's a new book by a friend of mine coming out that looks at the Japanese economy and argues that it is in some ways extremely well positioned to deal with 21st century challenges, both globally and nationally. But I would argue that it's not enough to keep pace. And the challenge, and the reason I wrote the book, and I explain this in the introduction, I believe, is that my concern as someone who believes very much in Japan and believes that it has a role to play and believes in the U.S.-Japan alliance is that the crisis occurs if the Japanese, if we're in a situation where we call on Japan to do things that it is genuinely not prepared or capable or intending to do, and it doesn't deliver, then we have a really, really, really severe crisis. So I want to dampen or make more realistic expectations about what to expect of Japan. And that's what motivated the book. And so the choices that the Japanese have to make are theirs to make, and they're important choices. And the end result is most Japanese look at the world and say, we like what we have. And you cannot guarantee that if we change it and give it up to do the things that you recommend, you neoliberals, that the result will be better than the world in which we inhabit. It may be declining, but it's a comfortable decline. I think there's a woman I quote who says, Japan has been a country in stagnation, and she sighs and says, but it's been beautiful, rich, and comfortable. And it's hard to argue with that. And it's not for me to argue with it. But the point is that the rest of the world is changing in ways that the Japanese are falling behind. It's not an utterly stagnant economy or society, but it's one that the change here is not keeping pace with the world around it. And thus, it is this gap between expectations and reality that I'm most interested in addressing and most concerned about.
Well, let's jump into that gap then, because that's a very interesting thought. There's a preoccupation in the world, and it's been there for a while, that you must grow. And when you're not, your country is falling behind and failing. And as you mentioned there, it sounds like a pre-planned downsizing, like a country that, for all the crisis talk out there, it may just be, though maybe not everyone's conscious that this is happening, but it may just be a country that is consciously downsizing and consciously accepting that the pursuit of this growth is not always something that you must push for. And this may be a lesson for other countries out there in the world. I'm wondering how you see that. And of course, and I might introduce a little quote here, which you bring in, and only because it is R. Taggart Murphy, who's quite a famous historian around a lot of circles these days. And he writes, it's not that Japanese executives do not understand the need to streamline inefficient practices. It's that they are not willing to do so. And I wonder if that spreads through the entire society in some way. They are quite happy with a shrinking world, even if they may not always express it in that way.
Absolutely. Tagg's brilliant, and his book is wonderful. The Shackles of History is a great book. I've known him for years, and I've always admired his work. Yes, the question of intentions is the key. The young people that aren't prepared to make the sacrifices, and I want to revisit that on two levels in a second. But first, let's go to this question of shrinking. And the fact is, yes, the Japanese are shrinking, and they are conscious of that. The Japanese population is 127 million. And Prime Minister Abe has said that we're going to hold the line at 100 million. In other words, he's giving up a fifth, 20% of the Japanese population. We are prepared to just let the country shrink. And there are other things in theory they could do, and they're choosing not to. If the Japanese were smart, if the Japanese were strategic, and if the Japanese were prepared to make certain changes, they would be extraordinarily well positioned to do exactly as you said, which is present a model to the world that talks about greater efficiency, of lower consumption economies, that makes a virtue of a graying, shrinking population, that tries to deal precisely with the challenges of a world in which greenhouse gases are an existential threat, in which demographics is a structural problem that is everywhere. The problem I see is that apart from the rhetoric, I don't see the Japanese making that adjustment. They are still, as I said, wedded to conventional notions of great powerdom. And so what you see is Prime Minister Abe making that concession to demographic reality, but still couching the terms in terms of national success and his image and ones of traditional great power or 20th century power politics, working on, modernizing his military, rather and doing, of course, some promotion of the ideational components of national power. But I sense that as a begrudging acceptance based on the realist 20th century structural, traditional notions of power. Changes are and there need to be more radical shifts that would accommodate the changes that we're talking about. And so, yeah, I mean, young Japanese live at home. They don't own cars. They consume less.
I'm also wondering at this point, if I can cut in, why do you think that is? This is an interesting one. Why do you think that is, that the rhetoric is there and yet the behavior might be different? Do you think it's like a slow psychological shift? Like I may think that I'm a Democrat, but my views change to Republican. I still call myself a Democrat for many years, even though my mind is Republican. Is it like a slow psychological shift in that way, which is just hard to accept? Or is there something more fundamental, more structural, more material on the ground making the problem?
I think it's deeper than that. I would say, the way I go through a long list of it, and here we risk getting into cultural stuff. And I think there's a lot of value to this. But, what is it? Number one, again, young people aren't prepared to make the sacrifices because they're not convinced that they're worth it. Again, they look at their generations, their parents and grandparents, and they say they did this and we're not really prepared to make those sacrifices. Life is good. On one level, most fundamentally, the role of women in society, right, is that women have said that we do not like the choices we're offered, which is essentially this, by and large, the society is changing a little bit, but not fast enough. Women are told, go to school. You probably won't get as good a degree as your peers, right? And as sexist as that sounds, that's nonetheless, I think, an accurate reflection. Remember, there was a scandal a year ago where medical schools were essentially keeping women out because of the belief that the women won't stay in as doctors. And sexism is rampant throughout this society. And women are told, you get a job, you get married, you drop out, you have children, take care of your in-laws. This is your role. And that's subtly reinforced by shortages of childcare, tax structures that penalize additional income, and expectations. And the women have said, no, thank you, no. I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to have kids. And that's the primary cause of the demographic change, of the demographic crisis that the country faces. And again, to stick with that for a second, in the 1970s, the demographers saw the crumbing crisis, and they were calling out and demanding attention to this. And it took me a while to figure it out, but not making a choice is a choice. When someone has alerted you to a danger of staying on your current trajectory, time and time and time again, for what is now 50 years, and you choose not to change that trajectory, you're making a choice that the world you live in is preferable to the world you could change to. And that's evident throughout the society. And so, that conservatism, it's a small c conservative country that says, we really don't want to like this. We really don't want to make those changes. It's a small c conservatism or a pride that says we constructed a political economic model that really seems to suit our culture and that worked incredibly well in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And maybe it's proven to be less well fitted to the 21st century, but it's still well fitted to us. And by the way, when we look around at these other countries and we see that what they have to go through, these incredible adjustments, the wrenching recessions that come from neoliberalism, when we look at China with its extraordinary size and growth, we say we don't want to compete. Don't drag us into your squabbles. Don't drag us out of our cocoon. Don't engage us in problems and in places where we really don't feel comfortable, which then, of course, then goes back to a fact that the Japanese themselves are less fluent in English, less inclined, because they've been so conditioned to look at wari wari nihonjin, we Japanese as an island, a homogenous island, look out at the world with some suspicion. It was announced in December of this year. This is not in the book. December of last year, that the Japanese have, by one measure, what's called the most valuable passport in the world. And by that, I mean that, or they mean that it is accepted in 190 countries without visas. other governments trust Japan. We're prepared to let the Japanese into the country without scrutiny. And yet, at the same time, the Japanese have the lowest rate of passport possession among any OECD country. There's less engagement in the outside world, less interest in the world. And if you think about it, that's reinforced here. You have a shrinking population, so you have less competition for jobs. So what you need to do is you keep your head down. You don't create black marks on your record. You just be a good little soldier. And if you get through college without screwing up in a great way, you're pretty much guaranteed to have some opportunities for you. Now, you may not be able to deal with the world beyond your borders, which in a country with a shrinking market would sort of be a requirement. So that suggests to me that the Japanese are going to be less innovative, less entrepreneurial, less able to adapt to external circumstances. But it also means that the internal pressures are to not take risks and not risk failing. Again, in a world in which entrepreneurship is important, suggest a little more conservatism. All of these factors, and there are more. There's a philosophy of what I call mujo, or not I call it, the Buddhists call mujo, which talks about the evanescence of life. This is all temporary. Thus, we should really be more accepting and more passive in the face of difficulties, that we should believe in law. We should believe in harmony. We shouldn't make waves. All of this together conspires to keep the country on the track it's on. And then, of course, this sense, one last, in a practical application too, a growing sense of alienation. In the political process, it says we can't vote for change because when we did it, it was a calamity. And B, the politicians don't listen to us. So why should we take a risk? Let's just step out, step away, exit rather than voice. And we'll just be comfortable living in the country with the most Michelin stars of any country in the world.
So let's step into that was a great summation, and that does summarize. And then we're going to come to what is the very last part of your book, which is this last little end note just after that summation, which is about what is going to happen, I suppose, this year, isn't it? 2020, the Olympic Games in Tokyo. And you end on this, and I'm going to have to quote you again here, because this, for many people, is going to summarize this idea of peak Japan and where we're coming from and just how you see this. Is so interesting. You write, when historians assess the Abe era, they will use the 2020 Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics as their benchmark. And then at the very end of this small chapter at the end, you write, you say, if all goes well and everything works out fine, then the Games will mark not the country's re-emergence. However, it'll instead be a valedictorian salute for peak Japan. So in some ways, it feels like you see Japan, this coming Olympic Games, as nothing more than a justification of the thesis in some ways, that government has overly invested in infrastructure projects. They've implanted themselves, and it's a band-aid, it's gimmicky, it's a shiny object, but it doesn't attach or doesn't address any of the fundamentals within the society that is actually causing Japan to hit its peak and decline in some ways.
Exactly. I think that's true. It's the Olympics are going to be quite a spectacle, although the coronavirus is now, it's going to be an interesting unknown in how this all unfolds, where we'll be and where folks will be in 6 months' time. But the Japanese are going to have their 8G technology, and they're going to create artificial meteor showers, and they'll have some driverless cars and all of that. There is concern. I have conversations about this every couple of days. Cybersecurity experts worried about what people are going to do, what malevolent forces will do to try to take down, the Olympics in Japan. There is already buzz about the hangover of the spending. Of course, the budget has gone way, way out of surprise, way out of line. Surprise hidden expenses. I'm trying to think of what my catalog of ills is. There is concern that all of the building that has accompanied the growth of the Olympics has actually starved the reconstruction of Fukushima of needed resources, and that this will be used as a way to kind of draw a curtain on that rebuilding process. And so, I think we're going to look at the Olympics and say this has been a true demonstration of what is capable of doing. And no one's ever doubted what Japan is capable of doing. The question again is, what is Japan, where is it positioned in the region, in the world, in a sustained way to keep up with in some respects, and then shape the course of events beyond its borders, and internally. And there's little appetite, it looks to me, to genuinely take the risks and push in ways that would make Japan more of an actor and more of the master. I mean, it's definitely not, as I said, not making a choice, though, is a way of mastering your own destiny. So I've got to be careful about that. But it promises to be I think, it will be the bookend. I mean, the important, what you left out of that, of course, is how that chapter begins, which is in 1964, where that discussion begins, which was when Japan hosted the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, the first time. And that marked its coming out party and its recovery from the destruction of the war and its rehabilitation into the nation. So I see 64 and 2020 as bookends, right, of an era for the Japanese. And that's what's going to be, so I think, so interesting and probably, for better or for worse, I think an accurate assessment and reflection.
And as a very last question here, it's been pinging through my mind as we've been talking through this. A very simple last question, though it does project a little bit.
You don't ask simple questions.
It does project into the future slightly. I wonder how you see the future of this, because in some ways you've been talking about the mindset of Japanese people, wanting a very different society. They may not want to grow. They may not want to be. They may not want to push for this grand society, this internationally dominant economic power in the way that they did in the past. But yeah, politicians like Abe, I've just been, as you were talking about the 2020 Olympics there, I was thinking of Abe's quotes that you have in the book, and he's talking about how this is going to be the grand moment for Japan's rebirth, and all the sentiment is still there. So I wonder how you see the future of Japanese politics. Do you think that this divide will close? That in some way in the next maybe 10, 20 years, you'll begin to see Japanese politicians who don't speak in this way anymore, who don't need to feel the need to talk about us being this great international dominant power? Do you think maybe the politicians' rhetoric will tone down and match perhaps the electorate's mindset and talk about maybe peak Japan and the reasons why we don't need to be following these ideas of the past?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's one of the points in the book, and it's one that I've been talking about since the book came out, is precisely the degree to which Abe represents not only the thinking of the country at large, and I think there's a big disconnect there. And I don't think he's dangerous. Let's be very clear. I think he's just more assertive and more conscious of international responsibilities than the bulk of the Japanese people. And he chooses to address those responsibilities, I think, in a very narrowly framed way. I don't think most of the people in the LDP agree with him and share his vision. And I think certainly not in the younger generation. As we talked earlier, there are great opportunities for Japan, however, to better align its capabilities, its resources, both material and human, in service of that larger objective. And to do that, I think that would require an adjustment more, I think, in the upper reaches of the country, or the political leadership in particular, and by that, both political, economic, the elites, to try to grasp a different sense of leadership. And to do that, I think that would truly, I mean, allow Japan to maintain a great role. I mean, there's only going to be a few great powers in the world, right? The Chinese and the United States are going to retain the status of great powers. The Russians will stay in that class by virtue of their nuclear weapons and their capacity to play spoiler. But they don't have the resources to truly shape, I think, the international competition in meaningful ways. They can just screw things up. But you'll see the rise of countries like Indonesia, of Brazil, of India. India may have some potential, but I think it's far off than most people believe. And for Japan to be more creative in its thinking about power, what power is and how to use it, it could really stay in the upper tier of countries, or it could just turn its back on international responsibilities, become much more of a Switzerland of Asia, where it's just leave us the hell alone and don't engage us in your problems. Let us be our own little thing. And they could do that as well. So, in many ways, Japan has important choices, and I'm not sure those choices will get made. I think so in many ways the interesting, or maybe the conclusion is choices will be forced upon Japan, and options will be forced upon Japan. And Japan will be less the author of its own destiny. Now, I think it's important, though, to recognize that a lot of this assumes other trajectories stay the same. There are ways in which external things that Japan cannot control change what happens, and that would change the large choices in Japan, its relative status. Bad things happen in China, and lots of futures become possible. And so I think we have to be alert that none of this is written in stone. None of this is determined. There is great variability and great range of prospects that are out there. But it seems to me that the choices that the Japanese have made, by and large, and the way that they're pursuing their lives, is that they are a productive, capable, and comfortable society. And while their adaptation is occurring, it is not occurring at the pace that allows it to sustain its current position. And that's not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with being number 8 or number 10, perhaps. But nonetheless, the Japanese have to adjust to a different place in the world. And we, and I say that as an American, which is its ally, and as Australians should worry, because it's Japan and Australia are capable, far more capable of doing things together than they are doing them separately. I mean, I always used to say the U.S.-Japan alliance was 1 and 1 equals 3. I think with Australia, similar logic is at work. The point precisely is the ability to mobilize our partnerships with the Japanese and with others, bilaterally, multilaterally, et cetera, to accomplish shared objectives. And we just need to be very realistic about what the Japanese are going to be able to do and wish to do. And that's, again, to go back to it, that to me is the most important issue. And it's not that I'm a great believer in this country and our partnerships. As an American, our partnership with Tokyo, and as with Australia, with the trilateral relationship with South Korea, et cetera, all those things together. But I think the foundation of that has to be a realistic understanding of what the Japanese country is and what its prospects are.
So that's a great note to leave this on. The book we've been speaking about today is called Peak Japan, The End of Great Ambitions. Now, it's almost become a cliche at the end of these podcasts. I say how much I've left out, but it's never been truer than this situation. There is so much in this book that I had to summarize into these long, dense questions that Brad was kind enough to answer. So the link is going to be below the podcast. I encourage listeners to go out and read it as much as they possibly can.
Jed, I'd also like to add for your listeners, if any of you actually are going to read the book, I would say that the logic and language and structure is far more coherent than the answers I've given to you today. But thank you so much for.
But I add to that too, Brad, if you like. It's well written, which is something which I was going to impose there. This is so many non-fiction academic style books that are so dense with research don't read as well as this book does. This is something that is going to be enjoyable to read as well. It is fun. It's going to flow. It's not going to be weeks and weeks of effort. So yeah, on that topic as well, definitely get out and read it. You will enjoy it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So on that, Brad Glosserman, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Hope to have you back again in the future at some point. Hopefully enjoy your weekend and avoid the coronavirus.
Same to you, and you know where to find me. It's always a pleasure, Jed, and thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk.